All for joining us, to our three witnesses, whom I will introduce in a moment. For too long, too many people in Ohio, too many people across the nation thought, for good reason, that their leaders had given up making our infrastructure, making our manufacturing base the best in the world. Congress is inaction, and the empty promises of presidents of both parties left Americans to fend for themselves as they swerved to avoid even bigger potholes, as they bypassed dilapidated bridges, as they dodged chunks of concrete falling from decaying overpasses, as they waited longer and longer for buses that were getting older and older. Americans saw the consequences of years of congressional inaction and presidents' broken promises. And they watched as other countries, our competitors and our adversaries alike, added high-speed rail, built better roads, upgraded their water and sewer, installed 5G networks. Our failing infrastructure was only compounded by a misguided tax and trade policies that shuttered factories in places like Zanesville, places like my hometown of Mansfield, and places like Kathy and Mike Knisely's hometown of Lima and Chillicothe, and jobs shipped overseas. Last week's hearing, I talked about how our economy and national security interests are interconnected. Ensuring that the United States leads the world in producing semiconductor chips is critical to both our entire economy and our national security. Because of the work of many of the senators on this committee, we passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the CHIPS and Science Act. But people don't really care that we passed a bill. That's sort of inside baseball. They care about results. Today, let's look at the results. 60,000 infrastructure projects, 60,000 already underway across the country because of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. These projects are improving 165,000 miles of roads, 9,400 bridges are getting repaired. Every state is benefiting. The Mobile River Bridge in Alabama is getting improvements. Rural and tribal communities in Minnesota and Iowa and other states are getting new buses and vans. We're making bus and rail stations that were built before the Americans with Disabilities Act finally accessible in places like Philadelphia and Cleveland. 6 years ago, Rob Portman and I introduced the Bridge Investment Act to replace or repair the hundreds of bridges in Ohio and thousands around the country that in many cases had not had serious repairs in literally decades. Now, because of the years of work we did that culminated in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, we're finally building a new Brent Spence companion bridge over the Ohio River. We're replacing the 90-year-old Western Hills Viaduct, crucial to Cincinnati. Brent Spence, for example, a critical link in the supply chain network, transports 160,000 cars and trucks and $2 billion in goods every single day. That's 3%. Think of that, 3% of the country's entire GDP. It's part of the fabric of the city of Cincinnati, helping to create the vibrancy of one of America's great cities. But Ohioans know Brent Spence is as dated as it is dangerously crowded. We've heard from Ohioans who are concerned about concrete crumbling on the Western Hills Viaduct. We're fixing that. We're seeing new construction across Ohio. It's not just huge projects like Brent Spence in the Intel fabs in Licking County. We're seeing major upgrades to streets and bridges across my state, including Ohio's rural counties and Appalachia. We announced this month the Market Street Bridge, which connects Steubenville with West Virginia. That'll finally be replaced. We're making critical investments to modernize public transit. Americans take 21 million trips on transit every day, and when buses and trains and all the infrastructure required to operate them are not up to date, service is less reliable. Think about this, imagine driving the same car every day for 40 years. That's what operators on Cleveland's RTA in its 60 cars have been doing for years, running the newest of these 60 cars is 40 years old. In Cleveland, I met with workers whose job it is to maintain rail cars that date back to the Reagan administration. At the rail car garage that I visited on the east side of Cleveland, you actually see these workers over in the corner machining replacement parts for cars that are sold. They can't find replacement parts. They have to actually they have to machine the replacement parts to keep these trains running. It's the only way to get the parts because they don't make them anymore. Now, finally, because of the infrastructure law, Cleveland will get 60 new rail cars. We know the U.S. lacks a robust national passenger rail network that other major economic powers have. We're changing that. We're seeing construction of new facilities to improve transit and rail service, like Akron Metro's, its public transit system, its new maintenance facility, and a new Amtrak station in Bryan, Ohio, a small town in the northwest corner of the state. We know how crucial manufacturing and innovation are to our economy. Modern infrastructure today is driven by information technology, the microchips that power our machines, and computers are the products of American design and ingenuity. We've become dependent on other countries for their production. 90% of the chips we invented are now made overseas. Taiwan is dominant today. Alarmingly, China is trying to become dominant tomorrow. We wrote the Chips and Science Act to change that trajectory. It's allowing us to build a new generation of chip production facilities in Ohio and around the country. These investments are growing our economy. They're creating jobs and opportunity. And in the past 3 years, we've added 670,000 construction jobs, 670,000 construction jobs added to the U.S. economy. Think about that. This is only the start. Hiring is expected to pick up even more in the coming years. More and more projects will get underway. That doesn't even take into account the jobs throughout the manufacturing supply chain, because we made sure these laws, again, first ever in the last few years, have the strongest Buy America rules ever. The steel, iron, pipes, and other construction materials are being made in Ohio and across the U.S. by American workers, not as previously imported from China. Pipe fitters, bricklayers, ironworkers, steel workers, carpenters, machinists are good middle-class jobs with high wages and on-the-job training opportunities where you can develop a craft and build a career. One of the highlights of the last few years for me was I saw Mike Nisley in Columbus. He's the Secretary of Treasury of Ohio State Building Construction Trades. He represents the men and women who are doing the real work on these projects. I was at an event last summer with Mike in our state's capital, a graduation for a training program that places workers directly into union apprenticeships in the trades, creating opportunity for so many people who haven't had that opportunity before. Every one of these graduates, mostly men and women in their 20s, had on T-shirts that said in big black letters on the back, "Direct path to the middle class," opportunities that most of these young people didn't dream of having. It's the jobs. We're creating a direct path to the middle class. It's how you build an economy that upholds the dignity of work. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. And thank you for the committee members who are here with us as well. One of the challenges I see on this conversation that we're having today is to realize that local problems need local solutions. It's really hard for folks in Washington, D.C. to understand the transit needs of folks in Charleston, South Carolina, Summerville, South Carolina, Columbus, Ohio, or Chicago, Illinois. The most effective thing that we can do is make sure that the resourcing goes without all the red tape and challenges that comes from Washington, D.C. Getting that done seems to be too close to Peter walking on the water. Nearly a miraculous occurrence and manifestation has to happen for us to just do the simple thing. I've spent half my career in politics on the local level, understanding and appreciating transit systems, infrastructure projects, and what it takes to get those things done. When I first became a senator, the one thing I did was I decided that as a kid who grew up in a single-parent household, mired in poverty, who understood the transit needs of the poorest Americans trying to get to the job, I wanted to make sure that I was sensitive to the current state of Americans trying to get to work. So I decided I'd go back to the old bus routes and get on those bus routes and spend time talking to people waiting on the bus to come. I remember talking to a grandmother who worked at Walmart who wanted to spend more time with her grandkids on the weekends, but she would spend 80 to 90 minutes early in the morning waiting on the bus, 7 hours at work, and 80 or 90 minutes to get back home. 3 hours to work a 7-hour shift for slightly more than minimum wage to provide the resources necessary to help our grandkids have a better life and a better opportunity to experience and enjoy the American dream. Having the conversations with folks who are struggling to make ends meet, thinking about how challenging it is as a local official to understand and then to decide the right transit routes so that the folks who need public transportation have access to the right routes at the right times to get to the right job. You just can't do that from Washington. The one thing Washington has done poorly is to put on more onerous burdens on local government and state government because somehow 535 people in Washington seem to know everything about local needs, and yet we seem to know nothing about getting the job done. As an example, my friends on the left are always looking for a new green steel. They call it the new Green Deal, but in the end, it steals opportunity and innovation, and creativity, and resources from local folks to make good decisions about what they need. But it's not just transit, it's actually the infrastructure needs that are delayed time and time again. I was thinking about this recently, and it takes about 7 years for a project to turn the shovel on a new highway program. I was thinking about Highway 17 and its expansion in Mount Pleasant in South Carolina a number of years ago. The frustration I felt as the chairman of the county, waiting for all the red tape to be cut so that we could simply turn shovel on a project that had been approved for years. And I sent some notes to my friends back on county council just to make sure that I was right about the 7-year process. It could take up to 2 years for the planning and the programming just to meet federal thresholds so that projects can start. And then after you do that, it can take up to 3 years, whether it's NEPA or other environmental challenges. You throw the Green New Steel on top of all of that, and you recognize that this onerous burden to start a road project takes 7 years. Now here's the challenging part. When you get the price of a highway project, let's say those days was several $100 million, $700 million, right? It's not anticipated that 7 years later, somehow, some way, miraculously, that same road project is going to cost the same amount of money 7 years later. That's what we call in South Carolina ridiculous, hogwash. It just doesn't work that way. But none of that is anticipated in the actual price that people pay. Waiting and waiting and waiting for the federal government just do their jobs and get out the way. But then after you get through the environmental review and compliance, which is 3 years later, then you go to the preliminary and final design. Up to 2 more years on this process. And at the same time all of this is happening, currently under the Biden administration, everybody wants to celebrate the IIJA and the IRA, the most ridiculously named bill in maybe American history, the Inflation Reduction Act that actually increases inflation, and the CHIPS and Science Act. What happens? Well, the cost of construction explodes to the highest level ever. It costs more money to do the same thing than it has ever cost 3 or 4 years later. And so when you take a 7-year delay on a road, you take all the impact studies that it takes, we're not smart enough to do them all at the exact same time. We're going to wait for the first 2 years before we start the environmental impact studies, before we start if this was a business, we would just fire everybody. That's what I would do. That's what I did when I was in business. If it takes you 7 years to get something started, I want someone else in charge. Americans want someone else in charge because the $2 billion problem that they have in Maryland to rebuild a bridge that's going to take 4 years is ridiculous, unnecessary. All you need is common sense and people ready to go to work. And unfortunately, every time well-intentioned politicians make the decision that we know better than the local community, it costs jobs. It costs prices because they explode. I gotta tell you, 13 years on the local level is a really good education on what not to do Let's not burden local government with the Green New Deal, that $7.5 billion in green funding that results in only 8 EV charging stations. That takes all those dollars away from being able to have real progress on real roads for real people to get to their jobs. Mr. Chairman, I'm glad we're having the hearing today. But I gotta tell you, most Americans would say, skip the hearing, block grant the money, and let a brother go to work. That's what they would say.
Thank you, Senator Scott. I'll introduce the three witnesses. Pleased to welcome Acting Undersecretary of Transportation for Policy, Christopher Coase. Mr. Coase was previously confirmed by the Senate as the Assistant Secretary for Transportation Policy, worked for many years advocating for safe and reliable transportation that builds better communities. Look forward, Mr. Secretary, to hearing your input. Michael Knisely served as the Executive Secretary and Treasurer of the State Building and Construction Trades Council since 2018. Prior to his current leadership role, Mr. Knisely served as president of the Lima, Ohio Building and Construction Trades Council. He oversees the day-to-day operations of the state council and supports its 14 individual local councils that comprise 137 trade unions and some 100,000 members. I'd like to welcome Mr. Knisely's family members visiting from Ohio today, his wife Kathy from Lima, his sister-in-law and brother-in-law Jennifer and Brad from Columbus, and nephews Griffin and Grayson. It's great to have all of you here. First time you've come to a hearing, I think, so welcome. And Mike, I look forward to hearing about the new jobs you're seeing and learning how we're bringing more workers. And I would add that, interestingly, I'm almost certain I will see Mike at the groundbreaking for the Brent Spence Bridge. It was announced by Senator Portman and me, the President of the United States, Senator McConnell, the governors of the two states. It was announced in early January, right around the time Senator Portman left office of 2023. The groundbreaking to build this bridge will be in less than 2 years. So thank you for that, and I assume I will see you at that. Dr. Richard Geddes is the founding director of the Cornell Program in Infrastructure Policy, a non-resident senior fellow with AEI. He previously served as Commissioner of the National Safe Surface Transportation Policy and Revenue Study Commission. Thank you for being here. Mr. Secretary, would you begin?
Good morning, and good, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today and for your leadership and partnership as we work to deliver projects to build a stronger, safer transportation system that connects American people to jobs, to housing, and to one another. DOT has been working tirelessly executing the vision of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Because of this generational investment, the Biden-Harris administration has announced $461 billion of awards funding over 60,000 specific projects in all 50 states, District of Columbia, territories, and for tribes. As I've traveled across the country, I can tell you these headlines don't come close to telling the full story about EJA's significance. Nationally, 47% of the U.S. population spends more than 15% of their annual income on transportation. EJA isn't just an investment in infrastructure. It's an investment in our economy and our workforce and in our nation's household budgets. EJA is allowing us right now to invest over $91 billion into restoring and upgrading our nation's transit service, creating thousands of new jobs and expanding affordable access to even more. Bringing transportation, jobs, and housing closer together improves access while also supporting local and regional economic development. In April, FTA announced the award of nearly $18 million to 20 projects in 16 states in transit-oriented development funds to support local economic development efforts to improve access and increase affordable housing production near transit. It's also critical that transit is available to everyone, regardless of their ability. That's why the All Stations Accessibility Program is so important, allowing us to upgrade and modernize legacy transit stations built before the Americans with Disability Act of 1990. Last month, we saw the groundbreaking for the first project to reach construction under this program, an upgrade to 6 transit stations in Philadelphia that will make them fully accessible and provide greater access to everyday destinations. We're also investing in projects to reconnect communities, including through the Reconnect Communities and Neighborhoods program. For example, in Columbus, Ohio, we're funding the development of a bus rapid transit corridor along the West Broad Street, which currently divides disadvantaged communities and is one of the most dangerous roadways in Ohio. Once completed, we expect the developability of this BRT system will result in more affordable transportation options, fewer pedestrian deaths, and greater private investment along that corridor. This project is just one example of how transit investments are helping transform disadvantaged communities into thriving ones. More broadly, we are exceeding our Justice 40 cover programs goal with 55% of our benefits going to disadvantaged community, particularly rural and tribal. For example, at the border of Montana and Idaho, we're funding the rehabilitation of a critical segment of the Interstate 90 to enable it to better withstand increased harsh weather events and make it safer and more reliable for travelers and vulnerable populations nearby. We're also replacing rural bridges in South Carolina that are disrupting vital farm-to-market and commercial freight routes with existing load restrictions due to their age and condition. In March, we experienced a painful reminder of the criticality of our nation's bridges to our daily lives and to our economy when the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore collapsed after being struck by a container ship. We all worked rapidly with multiple partners to reopen the federal channel and the Port of Baltimore in less than 100 days, and we continue to work with them to rebuild the Key Bridge. But even before that incident, we've been working with communities across the country to rehab and replace aging critical bridges. And that is why earlier this month, DOT awarded over $5 billion to 13 large bridges, including $250 million for the I-95 bridge over Lake Marion in South Carolina, $550 million for the I-10 Mobile River project in Alabama, $251 million to repair a cluster of bridges on I-95 in Rhode Island. These projects will join so many projects are already underway. For instance, we expect construction to begin soon on the Brent Spence Bridge, which carries over $400 billion in freight each year over the Ohio River. We are excited to see some of the earliest EJA investments to break ground and begin construction and start to deliver benefits. We are doing everything in our part to accelerate projects, including standing up a new project delivery center of excellence, streamlining our NOFOs, and providing technical assistance to rural and tribal communities. On behalf of Secretary Buttigieg and the entire department, we appreciate the partnership and the shared commitment on delivering a world-class transportation system for the American people. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Nisley. Welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee. Thank you for your leadership on building a resilient economy for American workers and the communities through federal investment. My name is Mike Nisley. I'm here to testify on the impact that federal investments are having on the 100,000 men and women that I represent as Executive Secretary Treasurer of the Ohio State Building and Construction Trades Council. In our nearly 60 years as the Building Trades Council, there's never been a brighter future for tradespeople who build Ohio. Ohio owes this bright future to smart public-private investment led by strong bipartisan leadership in Congress. And we're building big in Ohio. Over the next decade, we're looking at over $200 billion in construction projects that will create generational careers that provide prevailing wages with health care and retirement benefits, as well as tuition-free paid apprenticeship training for both present and future tradespeople. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act means that thousands of tradespeople in southern Ohio and northern Kentucky will build the Brent Spence Bridge. This bridge, which besides being long overdue, is a vital transportation corridor for our region and will be built by a diverse generation of construction workers, including tradeswomen like Saria Gwen May of Ironworkers Local 44. The CHIPS and Science Act means that nearly 10,000 construction tradespeople will build Intel's newest semiconductor fabs in Columbus, Ohio. This project is creating family-sustaining construction jobs across the central Ohio region, but also in Ohio's Appalachian communities where the residents can see opportunity on the horizon again. There's excitement in the air in places like IBW 1105's Training Electrical Center, where a whole new generation of tradespeople will begin their apprenticeships on the Intel project, including having the potential to work their entire career at that facility, upgrading and maintaining the fabs. Imagine that. Lifelong family sustaining construction careers within commuting distance of Ohio's counties. This type of investment has the potential to deliver lasting recovery in Ohio's struggling towns. Statewide, the Ohio building trades have scaled up their workforce development to meet the demand driven by these investments. Across Ohio, our 80 privately funded apprenticeship training centers are taking in their largest classes ever. The building trades model is the gold standard in workforce development, where they train over 80% of all construction apprentices in Ohio, and I must put on this, with zero tax dollars. The continued high road investment in construction projects generate the steady demand of apprentices needed for the next generation of local tradespeople. Underinvestment in our nation's infrastructure over the past 30 years has hurt economic growth in the communities where our members live and work. But now, with the new infrastructure investment in places like my hometown of Lima, Ohio, good-paying construction jobs are on the rise, creating an environment where young people do not have to leave the Buckeye State to support their families. The Ohio Building Trades believes that the rising tide of economic opportunity must be within reach for all Ohioans, including women, people of color, and veterans. Thanks to our partners in industry and at every level of government whose commitment to responsible contracting and sustainable jobs means that Ohio's rising economic tide reaches working families in Ohio. Our commitment to our partners is this: we will get the job done. We ask that you match our commitment by ensuring that federally funded construction jobs go to American tradespeople. These jobs must provide benefits to working families in our communities, and despite the heavy workforce demand in certain regions across our state, there are still depressed areas that have local tradespeople being displaced by companies that hire workers without the proper documentation to work well below the required prevailing wage and without any benefits. Properly executed, each new project built through federal investment strengthens Ohio's construction workforce by growing our communities through local wages and benefits for working families. And you can take the building trades commitment to equal economic opportunity to the bank. Our journey people and apprentices are protected by collective bargaining agreements. CBAs are the great equalizer in wages, healthcare, and retirement equity on every job site, and they guarantee that each worker, regardless of race or gender, earns dollar for dollar the same pay and benefits as everyone else. When Ohio's building trades people are bringing home a steady paycheck from major projects, their entire communities feel the economic benefits of those earnings. And thanks to federal investment, these are the working Ohioans who someday will drive past factories like Intel or across the Brent Spence Bridge and say to their children and grandchildren, I built that. Thank you for allowing me to voice economic stability and hope for the future of thousands of Ohio building trades people and a new generation of Ohio construction apprentices, and that have thanks to these federal investments in American workers. And I'm going to end with my final comment. Good infrastructure investment policies that come out of Washington create great outcomes in your local communities. Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Nisley. Almost every day I drive over Interstate 480 through Cleveland, and bridges and buildings are often named after politicians. Well, this bridge is called the Union Workers Bridge, as it should be. And as you know, building trades workers often saw a few lose their lives on these projects, these dangerous projects that matter so much for our country. Dr. Geddes, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and Ranking Member Scott and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. In addition to your kind introduction, I'm Rick Geddes, and Academic Director and founder of the Cornell Program in Infrastructure Policy, also a professor in the relatively new Jeb Brooks School of Public Policy at Cornell, as well as a professor of economics at Cornell. So I'll proceed with that. Thank you. Approximately 2 years ago, to take a step back, Congress passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act within the span of about 9 months. Together, those acts constitute the largest federal action on infrastructure since the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act of 1956, which created our interstate highway system. Those legislative acts are important in strengthening our country's infrastructure and addressing endemic problems, such as a large backlog of deferred maintenance, as well as creating a lot of new important projects. The actual impact of the acts on U.S. infrastructure to date, however, has been a bit less than expected for several reasons. First, inflation has been persistent since the acts were passed, particularly in the materials and labor needed to deliver much infrastructure, as I detail in my written testimony. Second, to Senator Scott's point, environmental permitting under the National Environmental Policy Act of 1970, or NEPA, remains cumbersome. As I and co-authors report in a 2023 article, a typical environmental impact statement, or EIS, under NEPA now takes about 4.5 years to complete and is over 600 pages long. Some EISs take more than a decade to complete. In an economic sector where time really is money, long schedules can significantly increase project costs. Permitting reforms in place in several other countries can be instructive as excellent models for the U.S. to implement, as I detail in my testimony. Third, provisions of the Build America, Buy America Act, or BABA, are inhibiting project delivery. We understand the motivation behind it, but they contribute to confusion amongst contractors and project developers. With the tighter BABA requirements, even minor products must be produced by U.S. companies to qualify for available federal incentives. Those items, however, are often not available or are more expensive than the imported versions, adding to cost and time delays. Ensuring crystal clear guidance regarding waivers under BABA is a key step, or could be a key step, in facilitating more efficient project delivery. There are, however, solid reasons for optimism in the infrastructure outlook. I believe we now have an opportunity for the private sector to take a larger role in financing U.S. infrastructure beyond that currently provided by the federal government. The Bill Act took steps to encourage greater private participation by increasing the national limit on private activity bonds, or PABs, for qualified projects from a $15 billion cap to a $30 billion cap. So the spirit of the law was there, but more can be done. These arrangements that encourage public and private cooperation can bring American infrastructure delivery up to global standards through better cooperation. The core of such cooperation is a long-term contract between the public and private sectors, broadly known as a public-private partnership, or PPP. Those contracts are helpful, particularly for addressing deferred maintenance, in that they typically bundle or wrap the design and construction of a major infrastructure facility together with the operation, or O&M, over the long term, such as 25 or 30 years. And that can include provisions to ensure proper maintenance. A properly structured P3 contract puts more of the risk of the time and cost overruns on the private partner rather than on the taxpayer. Such contracts can also include future-proofing. Future-proofing refers to the risk of not adopting available innovative technologies well into the future. A future-proof contract places that risk on the private partner, thus ensuring that private capital, incentives, and expertise are deployed to make U.S. infrastructure as resilient as possible for decades to come. I believe Congress can take further steps to facilitate greater P3 use in the United States, which is behind every other developed country I know, by the way, in P3s. One is to encourage states and regions to utilize PPP units, which are quasi-governmental entities that assist the public sector in undertaking PPPs. Such units are well established around the world, including Australia, Canada, China, Egypt, India, Israel, Japan, and the United Kingdom, among many other countries. I believe that with several key policy changes that I've described here, infrastructure projects can deliver long-term benefits and returns for all parties. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Geddes. Mr. Knisely, start with you. For decades, we've seen corporations follow the business model that pursued growth by closing factories, shipping jobs south and then overseas, always in search of cheaper wages. It's devastated the hometowns of each of us, of Lima and Mansfield. We passed the bipartisan infrastructure law in part to create the types of jobs that corporations can't outsource. The number of construction workers in Ohio is at a 24-year high and growing every week. You note that when people bring home a steady paycheck, the entire community feels the benefit. I love what you say about generational careers. Talk about how these projects create the kind of construction jobs that lead to these generational careers.
So let's, if we could, talk about the CHIPS Act. Can we talk about that, Senator?
Sure, of course.
So the Intel factory, I worked intimately with the company as soon as the announcement was made in Newark, Ohio, in late January 2022. And my job here in Ohio is to keep our 100,000 members to work every day through policies and some politics with this, but also by working with the owners on this. And so in the span of 3 months, myself and a small delegation went to Phoenix, Arizona, to the Ocotillo campus for Intel, to Portland, Oregon at the Hillsborough campus, and also to Albuquerque at the Rio Rancho campus. And we did tour the factory, and we saw the scale of what this does for not only construction workers, but what it does for the American public, reducing inflation, and for our defense, making sure that these chips are done here in the United States. But one thing that I found interesting by talking to the local workers there, and some of them had worked their entire careers, that was in my statement earlier, because of the commitment from companies like Intel that are not only innovative, but they're also changing their technology to stay competitive in that ultra-competitive market. It made a generational career for the pipe fitter or the electrician or the sheet metal worker that was in that local community. And some of them actually had 3 generations on that project due to this generational change that we're going to see the same thing in Columbus, Ohio. And so because of the CHIPS Act, that is now created that same dynamic in Columbus. We're building the project right now, but we know that right after, they call it phase 1, which is 2 fabs, the CHIPS and Science Act actually created the opportunity for 3 more phases, or another $80 billion in investment in the Central Ohio region. We know that that will now create that same model that we saw in the 3 other regions across the United States.
Thank you. And we have talked a number of times, Mr. Nisley, about the federal government helping to support workers, especially young people considering entering the trades. So I may ask you another question on the record about later about that in writing, just because of time. Mr. Coase, before we passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, big projects moved slowly or didn't move at all. We had seemingly forgotten how to build things in this country. That's why Senator Portman and I bipartisanly worked on this so much in Ohio, because we knew that it would actually result in speeding things up and making things happen. I want to talk to you about briefly Cleveland. The city's next transformational project is connecting downtown Cleveland to Lake Erie because of a large freeway and railroad tracks, and we know what interstate construction did, dividing communities, often communities of color. Because of that large freeway, because of railroad tracks, generations of Clevelanders have grown up near the lake but unable to access the lake. This project will help change that. If DOT's current competitive grant programs don't continue, what happens to the transformational projects like in one of our America's great cities like Cleveland's that our cities, counties, and states are developing?
The short answer is those projects sit on the shelf. These grants provide not only capacity to local governments to partner with private sector. I know that particular project is working with Bedrock and so many other private sector interests to think about how to do transformative projects. In addition to that, that means less people able to get jobs through these programs. We've seen already through the bipartisan interest law how discretionary grants are taking these mega complex projects like the Brent Spence Bridge from actually vision to actually execution. We are really excited that we're about to break ground on the Brent Spence fairly soon. But more importantly, it demonstrates that within the Department of Transportation, we have the capacity to take local ideas, even for big projects, and actually get them approved through our NEPA process in a timely fashion, at the same time getting dollars to the ground to get more workers on those projects.
Thank you. And those who, Connie and I live maybe 5 or 6 miles from Lake Erie, those not exposed that aren't lucky enough to live nearby the greatest body of fresh water in the world, which the Great Lakes is, might not see how important access to that lake is. And for far too many families, there are train tracks, there are highways that keep them from having access to that lake for recreation, for all kinds of opportunities. So your continuing that is really important. I just want to make one statement in response to Dr. Geddes, and sorry, this won't be a question, but I just wanted to thank you again for your testimony, how important it is to strengthen and update infrastructure. Your testimony pointed out concerns about expanded Buy America requirements. They must be clear. I agree with you about that. But Buy America policy represents a simple choice of the iron, steel, and materials used in federal infrastructure projects in Ohio and South Carolina made there or is it made in China? And I think it's pretty clear what the American people want if we're spending taxpayer dollars on infrastructure. I think the steel and pipe we use needs to be made in the United States. So thank you, all 3 of you. Senator Scott.
Thank you. Now, I was talking in my opening statement opening comments about the fact that the impact of inflation has driven the cost of construction to highest levels we've seen in the shortest period of time. I think about the Inflation Reduction Act that some continue to celebrate as somehow mitigating the impact on our country of inflation. Still, to me, a bit backwards. One program within that IRA is the Greenhouse Gas Fund that has to get $27 billion out the door by September the 30th. And the way I look at it, Dr. Getty's from an economist, you rush $30 billion, $27 billion out of the door in an already hot, artificially stimulated economy. Chances of it having a negative impact within the construction industry, I think, is pretty high, personally. I think the fact of the matter is that the COVID relief package, first bill passed by the Democrats, $1.9 trillion, the Inflation Reduction Act, the IIJA, the CHIPS Act, those resources flooding into the economy, some of it, not all of it immediately, only helped impact the inflation that the average American has been feeling. So from the macroeconomy perspective, the loss of spending power of the average American is around $28,000 cumulative over the last 3 years. 3.5 years. Can you please speak, Dr. Geddes, to the inflationary impacts regarding infrastructure specifically and its development because of the inflationary environment that we find ourselves in today?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I think it's two ways of approaching that. One would be from the macroeconomic theory that you mentioned, and you're stimulating demand in a highly supply-constrained environment. And the theory implies that that is going to be inflationary. On the sort of empirical or statistical side, it's difficult to tease out the effects of a particular program on the overall inflation rate.
Yes.
But I think it's worth noting, maybe emphasizing a part of my testimony to your original statement about how inflation in this sector, in the heavy civil construction sector, is higher. There's a block quote that I have from The Economist in November 2023 that says, "The problem is that inflation has been rampant in the construction sector, making delays that much more pernicious. The single biggest component of the infrastructure package was a 50% increase in funding for highways to $350 billion over 5 years. But highway construction costs soared by more than 50% from the end of 2020 to the start of 2023, in effect wiping out that extra funding." So the purchasing power effects are being diminished or wiped out by the added spending, or added inflation. I added some more up-to-date numbers on concrete costs and so forth, and it's still higher than the Consumer Price Index.
I want to ask you a question about NEPA, but before I go there, I want to once again highlight programs that the government continues to provide resources for, but they never actually spend the resources that they provide. As an example, back in 2021, Congress approved $42 billion to help connect more Americans to the internet, basically. Looking at a tweet that I saw and found, at this point, it had been 987 days since the plan was enacted, and 0 Americans had been connected, 0 shovels worth of dirt had been turned, even though there had been $42 billion set aside for programs to help connect Americans. The challenge, of course, the government rewards itself based on its intentions, not based on the actions that follow those intentions. You mentioned the cumbersome process that NEPA creates for getting shovel-ready projects started. Would you expound for the rest of my time that I have?
Sure. So NEPA had, again, very good intentions. I believe when it was passed in 1970, it's grown over time. It's sort of a whole lot of things going on.
A web of confusion.
In NEPA, it's grown administratively, and it's now become an extremely serious barrier to rapid project delivery. We're seeing that kind of in green projects where there's environmental groups that would like those projects to get out quickly, but then they sort of run headlong into this cumbersome NEPA process. And I think it's time for reform. I should probably highlight This study that I have here that came out in the past few weeks by one of my heroes, Bob Poole at the Reason Foundation, surveyed other countries and how they do their NEPA processes. Just to highlight, we don't have time, but I could go across countries. Australia has a sort of a one-stop shop for its environmental review and permitting process called the Department of Climate Change, Energy and the Environment and Water, and they have strict time limits on how quickly their reviews of environmental permitting processes have to go, like 20 days for the first stage, 30 for the second. So it is really a time-constrained process that still respects the desire to preserve the environment, as Australians do, but it doesn't have to be as long as it is in the United States. And as we know, Senator, time really is money in infrastructure.
Absolutely.
If you delay a project, it always goes up in cost.
Thank you. Last point, and I'm running out of time here. I'd love for us to, I'll submit it for the records, questions about the public-private partnerships that actually reduces cost, extends long-term maintenance, and puts part of the onus on the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Reid of Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony. And Under Secretary Coase, we are seeing a lot of activity in Rhode Island. In fact, we recently had a call from the Secretary Buttigieg informing us we received $251 million for a large bridge grant, which will access 15 high-need bridges along Route 195. So it's Route 95. And we're also seeing people working and working at very, very good wages. So this is, I think, a good program for Middle American workers and also for overdue infrastructure, and our infrastructure was way overdue. Could you tell us how, generally, how this project is improving infrastructure all throughout the country?
Thank you, Senator. You're absolutely right. We just, this past month, announced one of our big bridge improvement program that is actually addressing some of the critical needs that we're seeing in bridges across the country that are in a state of good repair. We believe these investments would not have happened without the bipartisan infrastructure law. And these investments are not only allowing us to hire workers from neighborhoods, but also allowing us to ensure freight resiliency and also allowing everyday Americans to ensure that they can get home safely. We are also seeing that private sector are also looking at other projects working in tandem with local governments. For example, we are very close to doing a major groundbreaking with the Bright Line West high-speed rail, which again would not have happened without the bipartisan infrastructure law. So those are just two examples of how working in tandem, these investments are really being transformative in communities.
And all of this work makes transportation more efficient, I presume. And second, it also is matched many times by private development, either directly in the project or very near the project, since the highways are opened up and it's more flexibility and more opportunity. Is that accurate?
That is absolutely true. As noted, in addition to the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're seeing major investments through the CHIPS program, where we're seeing major private sector investments for new chip manufacturing, as well as EV manufacturing, locating near these new improved infrastructure assets.
And Ms. Kinsley, how is this helping workers in the industry?
Senator Reid, workers are benefiting from all the legislation over the past couple of years that have came out of Washington. When you look at infrastructure, that's a little bit longer term maybe than what you would see with an EV plant or even the CHIPS side. But what you're creating in a time when demographics are working against all of us, and including the construction industry, it's created generational change for generational careers for young people. And I don't think they've seen that type of optimism come out for quite some time. I can't overstate the fact, and it was in my final comments, that the good policies come out of D.C. create great outcomes in every local community. It just does. Whether you're putting from the transportation side, new blacktop coming down, or for a long-term 30-plus generational career at a chips manufacturing plant. We anticipate our growth in the state of Ohio, even factoring in attrition with retirements and deaths, to move from 100,000 men and women that put a hard hat on and work in union construction every day in Ohio to somewhere between 115 and 125,000 over the next generation for this.
Thank you. And Secretary Coase, I could not leave here without mentioning the Washington Bridge, which I'm sure you've heard of, a section of 195 that goes between Providence and East Providence, essentially the metropolitan area of Providence. The eastward-bound bridge collapsed, or had to be closed before it would collapse, and we are seeking any support for effort to repair it. But it brings up the question of the mega grant program and also the large bridge grant program, and they have been helping states really in a significant way. We hope it'll help Rhode Island eventually, but can you comment on the role these programs have played?
Senator, first, I want to acknowledge, yes, we are aware of the application, and we'll definitely give it a due consideration. And again, we'll continue to provide technical assistance to the project sponsor as we go through this process. But you're absolutely right to call out that the MEGA program specifically, as well as a number of our major discretionary grants, allows us to move major complex projects faster. If we did not have these resources, many of these projects would take more time, which means they will cost more money, but more important, the benefits, whether it's reducing air pollution, greater accessibility, again, safety, whether it's from the freight corridors, but also to passengers, would not happen. That's why these investments are so critical today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Reed. Senator Van Hollen of Maryland's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for your testimony here today. Secretary Coase, I want to start with some thank yous to President Biden, Secretary Buttigieg, and to yourself on the really great, fast federal response to the collapse of the Key Bridge. A huge tragedy, of course, for Baltimore City, our state, and had national implications. We're grateful for the fact that we were quickly enrolled in the emergency relief program, the $60 million for traffic mitigation, and of course, other federal agencies that helped clear the channel and open the port. But obviously now we want to move forward with the reconstruction and are really pleased to see the President's disaster supplemental that includes $3.2 billion for the emergency relief program. And we look forward to working with you on that to try to make sure we get it through the Congress just as quickly as possible. I will say that if that had also been a transit route over the bridge, it obviously would have been even a bigger catastrophe in terms of transportation. So I do think we need to be looking in Congress at an emergency relief program that applies not just to bridges and other transportation sort of roads, but also to transit. And another thing I just wanted to flag is I've been working on the Moving Transit Forward Act with Senator Fetterman, which would address some of the operational sides of the expenses and costs for states. I know your budget, as you proposed it, allows metro systems around the country to use their funds for either operations or capital, and I think that's a good direction to go, and we want to build on that. Thank you also for attending a gathering earlier this or last year, I think, but with Governor Moore, Senator Cardin, and myself, Congressman Afume, on the red line. And obviously the bipartisan infrastructure bill has been mentioned a couple times this morning, but just want to remind you, and I know you're aware of it, that bill has a provision in it, and I'm quoting from that bill: "The Secretary shall provide full and fair consideration to projects that seek an updated rating after a period of inactivity following an earlier rating and evaluation," end quote from the statute. So would you agree that the previous work done by MDOT and FTA in support of the Baltimore Red Line project should not be wasted, and that once submitted to FTA, the Red Line project should be able to receive a rating more quickly given all the previous work that had been done?
Senator, I will just say, as I said previously when we were together in Baltimore, you have my commitment to working with the state and Baltimore to get this project across the finish line. And yes, we do agree that the information and effort that had been previously done should be part of the process. And that's why I'm pleased to say that even as of today, FTA is working closely with the state and the transit agency to do that, just that. So we hope that in near term, we'll have something more positive to say.
No, I appreciate that. Just for my colleagues' benefit, our previous governor pulled the plug on the Baltimore City Red Line after it had already gone through all the reviews and approval. Essentially, Maryland sent close to $1 billion to the rest of the country. But as part of the infrastructure bill, we included this language, and under the current governor, Governor Moore, and the city, we're all moving together to get the red line on track, literally. I'd just like to also ask you, Secretary Coase, about some of the transportation safety issues. We had included in the infrastructure modernization bill provisions from a bill that I'd introduced that deal with transit safety, establishing these safety committees to identify safety risks, and I understand that the department and the FDA are close to finalizing a general directive to transit agencies to address specifically assaults on transit workers. That's a piece of this overall safety plan. Action on these issues cannot come fast enough. Last year when we had this hearing, I actually had a witness from the Baltimore Transit Union, and that morning he'd been in the hospital with a transit worker who'd been assaulted, stabbed. So what is the timeline for finalizing the general directive and additional rulemakings to protect workers and riders from assault?
Senator, as you know, immediately after the enactment of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the FTA sent out immediately a Dear Colleague letter to every transit agency, letting them know that they need to send up their own safety committees. Since then, I can tell you 100% of the transit agency are in compliance. In addition, as you mentioned, we have put out a draft a general directive. We've now received those comments. We are hoping the next couple of months that we'll be able to finalize those comments and go out publicly with the final directive.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I may have some follow-up questions for the record,
Absolutely.
but thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Van Hollen, Senator Smith of Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to all of you. Thanks so much for joining us today. So I want to focus my questions to you, Mr. Coase, and I'm going to focus for a minute on rural transit. So I chair the Transit Subcommittee, and I also represent a state with large communities, of many communities of rural places and small towns. And I know that mostly when we talk about transit, as my good friend from Maryland is, we think about what goes on in big cities. We think about big buses and trains. But of course, we know there's an incredibly important network of rural transit agencies across the country, including in Minnesota. And we also know that the bipartisan infrastructure law puts significant new resources into rural transit and increased funding for programs like bus grants and low and no grants that really benefit rural agencies as well. Minnesota has received 2 of these grants from the FTA for rural transit, one for SMART, which is based in Austin, Minnesota, to build 2 new transit facilities, and one for UCAP and Friendly Rider Transit to buy propane buses and then install the fueling infrastructure that they need. So I think that one of the best things about the Bipartisan Infrastructure and Jobs Act is that it is lifting up all of these communities, including rural communities that often have many people who rely on transit to get around. So could you just give us sort of at a high level what your view is of how the Biden infrastructure law has really supported rural transit around the country?
Senator, thank you for that question and also your leadership on this topic. As someone who grew up in rural Southwest Georgia, with a mother who was disabled, I know firsthand the importance of rural transit. Being able to get an elderly grandmother to a doctor's appointment, or just be able to take a father to a veterans hospital. Without having a car, rural transit was a lifeline. So I can tell you, because of the bipartisan infrastructure law, we've now seen historic resources going directly to rural transit through formula dollars, but also through our discretionary dollars. We have now over $11 billion of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which represents close to $35 billion of resources, going directly to meet the unique needs of rural communities. That would not have happened without the bipartisan infrastructure law.
Thank you. I think it's just illustrates how this law has helped so many rural communities in so many ways. And I also know that rural transit authorities tend to be small, they're scrappy, they're very innovative, and they don't have a big grants department that they can rely on to go and chase these federal dollars. So I know that you all have put a lot of time and energy into figuring out how to help rural transit authorities navigate through these different federal grant opportunities and reporting requirements that also follow. Could you just tell us a little bit about that work? Because I think it's important for people to understand.
Absolutely. We have stood up within the department a number of rural-specific programs to provide direct technical assistance. We have a $20 million technical assistance program directly for rural and tribal communities to not only understand how to navigate the federal process, but also how to deliver a project. Because sometimes that rural mayor or that transit operator, it may be also the planner, but also might be doing five other jobs. And so the federal government can't just be on the sidelines. We want to be a partner. In addition to that, we also know that we want to support rural communities as we prepare for the 21st century. We have stood up a new rural EV toolkit that provides rural communities a step-by-step process to make sure that they're not left behind with the electrical vehicle revolution. But also, we're seeing amazing innovation where rural communities working with state DOTs are partnering with private companies. For example, we awarded $9 million to the North Carolina DOT to partner with 9 rural counties and VIA to provide on-demand services for those residents. That's just an example of how we can meet the needs, but also prepare rural communities for the front. And that's what the bipartisan infrastructure law allows us to do.
I really appreciate that. I also appreciate you highlighting the innovation that we see happening in these rural transit agencies that have to be creative because the models that might work in a larger city are just not going to work there.
Exactly.
And so they are doing some pretty incredible work to make sure that people can get around and can be connected. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Smith. Thank you for your comments about transit. Senator Kramer is coming back, so I'm going to go a bit of a second round until he does. Under Secretary Coase, I appreciate what you've said about transit-oriented development. One of the wonderful things about getting to chair this committee, when I took it over, it's always been called Banking, Housing, and Urban Development. It was really the committee that took care of Wall Street until I became chair, and we have emphasized sometimes, and Senator Smith does that, sometimes calls it housing and banking, but one of the focuses of this committee is public transit, and there isn't nearly enough interest in this town in public transit. It gets a whole lot of people, particularly moderate income people, to work. I remember a story. I was in Cincinnati one day, and their public transit system is called SORTA, and I talked to the leader of the transit system who was struggling with keeping some additional routes that are there during the week, but routes that they don't have enough ridership for the weekend. And there was a young woman who worked at a moderate $10 or $12, $13 an hour job. And the transit system, she had to work on Saturday. The transit system didn't run on Saturday, so she had to Uber to work on Saturday. She talked to her boss, and her boss said, "You got to come in on the weekend. That's the way it is if you want to keep this job." And she had to Uber to work on Saturday, which ate up most of her income. So one of the things we're able to do is expand the service of SORTA service. So Senator Kramer just entered. I'll turn to him in a second. But I like what you said about the opportunity for new housing construction near transit developments. That's really important in all the big cities and the moderate-sized cities in my state. It can support, and what DOT can do to support such transit-oriented development, and transit-oriented development can bring you opportunities to those communities, again, especially those communities that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s were essentially almost demolished for interstate highways. And I look to any of the major cities in my state, particularly Columbus, where the number of people living in a neighborhood on the east side of Columbus, mostly African-American, shrunk by about 2/3 because the highway went through disrupting demolishing businesses, demolishing people's homes. They had to move elsewhere. The community's vitality was essentially sapped and wasn't able to rebuild. So always thinking about those issues. So thank you for that. Senator Kramer from North Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Coase, I'm gonna initiate a conversation with you that will play off a little bit, I think, on your conversation with Senator Van Hollen relating to formula fixes. So I'm looking for some potential fixes. To a challenge I just learned about recently, I was at a groundbreaking ceremony for an expansion of the Hector International Airport in Fargo. And Fargo, of course, is our most populous city in North Dakota. And the mayor, Mayor Tim Mahoney, came up to me, and it's one of the great things about a small place. The mayor talks right to you. He's better than any lobbyist, just so you know. And I love my lobbyist friends. But he brought this to my attention that Fargo had gone, they had one more baby or something and went from 199,999 people to 200,000. So you already know where I'm going. And he noticed this, reduction in the formula funding, or at least in the amount that Fargo got. Now, it gets a little more nuanced than that, and I'm sure you're familiar with that, because they went from an MPO to a TMA, in the transit funding. But by the way, just so you know, and I think this gets back to your previous discussion with Senator Van Hollen. The formula changes, of course, but not just the formula, the flexibility for the community to use the money the way they were using it, which in this case of Fargo was for operational expenses, and not understanding all of the fungibility of cash and all the ways you maybe could do this. He was just asking for help. And so as we dug into it a little more, we learned that there are, in fact, rules, laws that govern how you can distribute these funds, the transit funds, based on the size of a community. My concern is that there's a little bit of a perverse incentive in that formula that actually discourages growth. And we don't want that, I don't think, on the one hand. On the other hand, maybe there's a rational reason for it. My ask of you is just I describe this situation, tell you this story, and then maybe just see if you have some thoughts about it, ideas on how we could either legislatively or through budget process or whatever discretion the agency would have to sort of not punish communities like Fargo and see if there's a better way to do this.
Senator Kramer, thank you for bringing that issue here, not only to my attention, but I know this is one that's shared within our building.
Sure.
Communities need to be able to meet their needs. And we believe that whether it's through the formula program or even from our discretionary grants, we should be able to give them as much flexibility to achieve those goals. We do believe, and as I was discussing with Senator Van Hollen, that transit agencies, particularly coming out of COVID, are recognizing that travel patterns are different.
Sure.
We're seeing that now developers want to build near transit and create more walkable communities. We need to give transit agencies their ability to leverage not only the pent-up demand that they're seeing in the private market, but also the unique needs of their residents as we do these travel demands. So we would love to work with you, as we stated with Senator Van Hollen, to look at how we can make sure the formula programs, particularly on the transit side, particularly these larger systems, have the flexibility they need to meet the changing environment, which again comes back to people want to live in great quality neighborhoods.
Sure. Well, and I love that you refer to them as larger communities, because we kind of consider Fargo to be larger than the small ones,
Right, exactly.
but smaller than the large ones.
That's what they said about Thomasville, my hometown.
Right.
We're still a small town.
Yes, that's the flexibility, which is I really appreciate. And quite honestly, and I know we've been talking. Obviously, we're talking about the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which I not only supported, voted for, but championed. And the formula issues of all of the distribution of funds is really important to small states, right? That we can't sort of reserve 100 miles for gravel in the middle of an interstate highway system. But similarly, for our communities where you have populations that certainly depend on good transit systems, we just want it to be, to your point, be successful. We want the communities to be successful. So to the degree there's legislative fixes that are necessary, maybe Chris and I could work together with you on some of that, right? And then where there's flexibility within the agency, we should encourage that as well.
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, that's all I have. Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Kramer, thank you for the thoughtful questions and the follow-up, and it was worth stalling a little to wait for you to get back here. So thank you for making us all think about these important issues. Thanks to the three witnesses today. It shows we're making progress in long overdue investments in infrastructure and the men and women of the construction workforce leading the way. I love thinking about that bridge I mentioned. We have much more to do in the years ahead. I'll keep working with USDOT. Thank you for that, and others at your department on Ohio priorities like replacing more bridges, building big projects like the North Coast Connector in Cleveland. I'm going to keep reminding you of that. We'll continue working with the building trades to ensure that our transportation infrastructure and manufacturing sector, as you pointed out, Mr. Nisley, are making the nation's economy stronger, more competitive, and delivers more of the generational jobs that you talked about. Thanks for the witnesses for testimony today. For senators who wish to submit questions for the hearing record, those questions are due 1 week from today, Wednesday, August 7th, and witnesses have 45 days from that day to follow up with answers. So best wishes. Thank you all. The committee is adjourned.